So hello and welcome
Hello.
to Chris Dale, who is the author of this book right here, Better Halves, Rebuilding a Post-Addiction Marriage, which is one of the first books out from the newly rebranded Thornapple Press, which is the successor to Thorntree Press. I'm Eve Rickert. I am the publisher at Thornapple Press, and I'm joining from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Lekwungen and Saanich peoples, also known as Victoria, British Columbia. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Christopher Dale. It's my first book. Really grateful to be joining the Thornapple family. Native of New Jersey, currently coming to you from Delaware. So that's me.
Great. And Chris, as I mentioned, is the author of Better Halves, which has been out now for a couple of months. And this is one of the first in a series of videos that we're going to be doing at Thornapple of me just in conversation with our authors about their books and their work and anything else that we want to talk about. So I'm just going to touch real briefly on why I acquired this book, why I was interested in your proposal when I saw it, which is that to me, there is vanishingly little information available from people who have caused harm in their relationships, people who, as you acknowledge in this book, have done really terrible things and gone through the lengthy and arduous process of repairing those relationships. And there's a broader conversation right now happening culturally about how we address harm, so-called cancel culture and transformative and restorative justice. And, my friend Nora Samarin, who co-authored the foreword to Polysecure with me, has written a lot about, repair in relationships. And I saw this and I thought, well, this is the kind of book that I would love to see in the world. I want to know how you did it. I want to know how you and your wife made that journey back together and how you took accountability and repaired with her. So thanks for writing this book.
Thank you.
And I would love to hear about why you wrote it.
I wrote Better Halves largely because my wife and I, well, the genesis of the book came from when I got clean and sober. For 3 years, I had a very bad cocaine problem. And when I say very bad, I mean, it was like every other day. Couldn't string days together. And when that finally subsided with my wife, Patty, more than a foot out the door, it got better because I wasn't using anymore. And then it stopped getting better. And the reason for that is that I had done Patty a lot of damage. And two people who finally felt like they were coming out of a protracted emergency kind of looked at each other, said it was going to be okay, and figured the hardest part was over. And maybe the hardest part was over. Maybe I was done blowing lines off of the kitchen table while she was at work for 10 hours a day. But we still had a lot of work to do. And the relief of the active addiction part of this being behind us made us complacent. And the other big thing that made us complacent is that we didn't know that this needed to be a mutual recovery and not just me recovering from addiction. So a lot of times what happens in really early, I call it fledgling recovery, sobriety, is that one partner goes to AA, goes to NA, goes to SMART or whatever group-centric program they might use. And I think they're all great. That person starts getting better at a kind of a steep incline because that's what's necessary in early sobriety. They get on something called a pink cloud. Well, their spouse or partner, in this case, my wife, kind of stands still and is left with all this damage. Like, I mean, my God, did I damage this person who was a confident, woman, a confident, easygoing woman. I turned her into a cynical, self-questioning, she was just not quite a shell of herself, but she had a lot of damage. There were stains on her soul that weren't there before her husband became an addict, and she was part of all of it. I didn't become an addict until a few years after we were married, and so she got the whole full brunt of it. And the reason I wrote this is because I can't believe that we navigated that without a lot of tools. And the reason there weren't a lot of tools is because those tools didn't really exist. She tried Al-Anon. She didn't love it. I don't think Al-Anon would have been a cure-all even if she had. It just didn't seem like anybody was encouraging us to actually move forward together as a couple and clear some harm and dive deep and out of the way and do like a really rigorous, long-standing amends that I needed to kind of a working amends that probably is ongoing to this day. But that's the way I wrote the book. I felt like there were going to be a lot of folks following in our footsteps who were going to fall into the same traps that we did, make the same wrong turns that we did. And maybe if they had some kind of a memoir-driven / self-help thing, they can kind of maybe not make as many mistakes as we did, which is the point of recovery to begin with. It's people who've recovered, showing us kind of the path that they walked, and so that maybe it's a little less obstructed for the next guy, right? So that's how I wrote the book.
One of the things that does strike me in the book is how much you talk about Patty's perspective and experience, and how much empathy you have for her. And one of the things that I wondered, and others may as well, is first of all, what was her role in writing this book? And then beyond that, why you and not her as the author of this book?
Her role in writing this book was not leaving me. And being very patient and very open with being as candid as I was in the book. My wife was a proud Asian American woman with a proud Asian American family. So culturally, there were some sticking points there that she was a little bit hesitant with. But she's not a writer. She's not a writer. She's a public relations person like me. She's more of a team manager than me, but what I do 50 hours a week is pretty much right. Also as a communications person, but kind of more in the editorial side of things. So I just think that the person who had the impetus to write a book wrote the book. But you're right. I think it could have been an interesting book from her perspective as well. I think what the hardest part of all this came from her in terms of our journey, because I had to keep getting better because I absolutely had to. My threat was existential. In my opinion, alcoholics and drug addicts either continue to get better or they backslide. And if they don't get over some of the character defects, at least the major ones that led them to drink and drug in the first place, then literally their life is in physical danger. Now, I'm punching up the whole time because I'm reaching up, not punching up, I'm reaching up. I'm trying to reach for the surface. I'm trying to reach for the next rung of the ladder. Meanwhile, Patty's already above me because she, just by standing still and watching her spouse sink to the bottom of this well, she's the one who had to be okay with letting the person who hurt her the most play an integral part in the recovery process. And that takes an ability not to forget, but definitely to forgive, and to be able to see a time, even if it's a little off in the distance, as to where we can both stand together as truly equal partners yet again. Because if you can't see that, if you can't get there, the marriage isn't going to work. I'm sorry. It's just, show me a marriage that can last with permanent imbalance, and I'll show you a marriage that isn't very good.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a bit? Because you do talk about that in the book, the imbalance that's created in the marriage during your addiction, and then the complexity of restoring that balance.
Yeah, you're right. Sure. So from the number one, the event, the moment one person crosses that kind of blurry, ill-defined line between a recreational user and an addict, someone who has to do it. I went from really liking to do it to absolutely needing to do it. With cocaine, I went there pretty quickly. That creates automatically a scale of imbalance that obviously, not obviously, but ironically, first it tips towards the addict, actually, because when I first kind of crossed that line, I still had a job, I still had a bank account, I still had most of my sanity. And what that allowed me to do is to become a really good liar, lying about working late, lying about people that I was out with that didn't really exist while I was, doing blow in a barroom bathroom by myself, as the disease progresses, as the condition progresses. I'm not entirely sold on the disease concept. As the condition gets worse, you become a sloppier liar. The spouse begins to suspect things. There begins to be some kind of breadcrumb evidence, maybe if not ironclad evidence, that something isn't quite right here. And it starts to slide toward the spouse or partner who isn't an addict, right? That's the beginning of it sliding all the way down. When I hit my bottom, I was unemployed and unemployable. Patty was foot and a half out the door. She threw me into rehab. I didn't get better right away. The abuse went from chronic to episodic, which was progress, but it wasn't perfection by any stretch.
The drug abuse.
Yeah, the drug abuse. And, that's totally imbalanced. My wife was employed, had a roof over her head by her own means, was free, wasn't worried about, law enforcement or when she was going to be able to put food on the table if something went bad. I was one locked door away from basically being homeless, at that point. That is complete imbalance. And how you get back to full balance certainly doesn't take place just by one person, the addict stopping the active abuse, right? So that was the journey. That's the journey that kind of led me to write the book, right? Because it wasn't going to get better overnight, even though I stopped drinking overnight, courtesy of the New York City Police Department. So for the record, my last drink was crashing into I was trying to going into Manhattan from New Jersey to get drugs, and I crashed I sideswept a cab in the Holland Tunnel, which separates New York and New Jersey, and I kept going. And basically decided to play a Jason Bourne movie on the streets of Manhattan, which doesn't work because there's this traffic.
Right.
So about 4 blocks out of the tunnel, I'm in handcuffs and on my way to jail for the night. And there went the license. There went, my escape vehicle. There went my car. Was finally kind of ready. That was October of 2011, and 11 years later, I haven't had a drink yet. So
yeah. I'm going to come back to talking about the book and that rebalancing process, but what you just said did remind me of a question that I wanted to ask you, which is how does it feel to have this story out in the world? I know you say in here something about explanations possibly being owed to your colleagues. So it's all out there now under your real name, and you're talking about stuff like the time that you spent the night in jail, and how has that been so far?
Yeah, the time that I spent the night in jail, I told my new boss, who is still my boss, that my grandfather had died. My grandfather proceeded to live for another 10 years, so God bless him. It just passed away last year. How are they? They're very supportive. I think luckily, the same skills I applied to writing a book like this of, basically of written communication there's flashes of that I employ every day in my job. I think that helps people be okay with it. I think the distance between, this isn't a book I would have written 1,000 days into recovery, but 11 years into recovery, you can have a little more faith that person is kind of done with that portion of his life. Right. So I am more and more grateful that the world is getting more and more open to people who are in recovery. People are becoming less anonymous, so to speak. I was never anonymous. I hadn't been anonymous for a while. My writing had been out there. I'd written
Mhm.
for recovery websites. Wrote some addiction specific stuff for some of the newspapers here in New York, the Daily News, the New York Post, and New York Newsday.
Mhm.
So it was out there already. The full brunt of it wasn't out there. The
Mhm.
alcoholism my colleagues knew about, the cocaine stuff they didn't, and now they
Mm.
do.
Okay.
But to answer your question in a brief anecdote, when I had the book signing,
Mhm.
half of my office was there.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So that's
Yeah.
a nice touch.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, what I will say, and what I just to add on to this is kind of an aside. Unfortunately, I think that addiction and alcoholism are not cancer.
Mhm.
Um, you can't, and you can't get a brain tumor and go rob a bank and blame it on the brain tumor.
Mm.
So you can't be high on cocaine just because you can't stop doing it and go do something horrible and then just blame it on the condition of
Mhm.
addiction.
Mhm.
There's a lot of damage there that needs to be taken account for.
Mhm.
And sometimes I worry that by telling people that they are just a person who suffers from substance abuse, it
Mhm.
does limit the ability of some people to take total accountability for their actions.
Mhm.
And if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be married
Mhm.
anymore. And I wouldn't have that 7-year-old kid out there playing with his mom in the backyard.
Mhm.
So
Right.
there's that.
Yeah. So how did that happen for you? The taking, well, for both of you, the taking accountability part.
Well, the accountability was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
It happened because, okay, so it's complicated. You get into the program and in my case, it was AA, because it's the most prolific one out there. I
Mhm.
also dabbled in NA meetings too. I think, they're both basically the same program with different substances attached to it.
Mhm.
And it's insular, it's cliquish, and it's wonderful. Working the 12 steps in the first year of recovery and starting to sponsor other guys, the light went on.
Mhm.
The problem was Patty didn't play a very big part in that.
Mhm.
And if you look at it from the spouse's point of view at that point, she's sitting at home wondering where the hell I am. She knows I'm probably at a meeting, but maybe I'm not.
Mhm.
And she also knows that deep down, she didn't play a very big part in getting to do it. She's watching something happen that she'd been trying and failing to do for years, which is get me clean and sober. It's not that
Mhm.
she was failing at it, it's that she really didn't have the tools to do it. Again, I
Mhm.
find that this is a takes one to know one disease. You know, um, Watching the light come on is pretty glorious, but loving somebody, watching their light come on and having no part in it can have definitely be a bittersweet
Mhm.
experience. And I didn't involve her enough, and she didn't know what she didn't know, which is that we didn't know what we didn't know. It's that and that's something is that she really needed to start looking at the damage on her side of the street, even if it was the damage that I put there. Okay.
Mhm.
Like it doesn't, at the end of the day, the damage is there. And regardless of who did it, and we all know who did it, she's the one that has to swallow, step forward, and start to clean that stuff up with or without me. She would have
Mhm.
had to do that with or without me. And that's when going back to what I was saying about, I'm a lot more impressed about what Patty did than what I did. I saved my
Mhm.
life. She saved our marriage. I
Mhm.
saved my life. She saved our marriage. Right.
Yeah.
Because if she wasn't willing to budge on that, if she was going to insist on being eternally owed an unpayable debt,
Mhm.
this marriage was not going to last,
Mhm.
because I'm just not the kind of person who's going to sit there and take that I'm not to be out the door, you know.
Mhm.
And that's a very quick situation to her putting her foot down and me putting my foot out the door,
Mhm.
and that almost happened
So,
a couple of times. I'll be honest with
mhm.
you. Before we got it right, we got it wrong, and
Okay.
that's one of the reasons I wrote the book too, because I
Mhm.
think there was a lot to say about what not to do. Everybody sets
Mhm.
an example. Sometimes I set a bad one.
So, yeah, speaking of examples, can you tell me an example of what not to do? But then I'm also interested in, some of the key things that that she did or the two of you did that you think were really pivotal to your ability to come back from what happened?
Yeah. What not to do. What not to do is got people who are in AA, NA, and smart, and basically every group-centric program has some version of making amends, right? Because, find me an addict who doesn't have amends to make, and I'll sell you a Brooklyn Bridge, right? So, we've all done damage out there. We all have bridges to rebuild, fences to mend, things like that. In AA, it's the ninth step. That's what it is. And it's the ninth step for a reason, because if you did it first, you'd screw it up. You have to work some of these other steps first, which involve taking inventory and things like that. But still, you get to the ninth step and you're amazed. I was amazed. Most people are amazed by how easy it is at first. You're looking at the ones, so I think I can do these now. The friends, the relatives, the people who already know that I'm in recovery and I'm trying to get this right. And 99 times out of 100, they are extremely happy for you and very eager to say, I really appreciate you coming to me. Let's just, the amends I want you to make is to continue to take care of yourself and Patty and all that stuff. And even with former colleagues who you may have burned once in a while, maybe it goes well, maybe it doesn't. It's not, who cares if that person blows me off? It's not the end of the world. At least I tried. But when you come to your spouse or partner with the superficial amends, when you come to with an "I'm sorry, babe," and don't follow that up, that's one of the things that you should not do. That's what we did. That's what I did. And it didn't work. It wasn't sufficient. I moved on to step 10 and our marriage sat stagnant like it had been. And we ended up fighting a lot. And I think a lot of the reasons that we were fighting a lot is because I hadn't made a proper amends. I think things started to seem like they were getting normal. And because they seem like that, you don't dig deeper to think if there's, maybe something more that needs to be done here. That's part of the problem too, is that when an addict puts down drugs and alcohol, both the lives of him and his spouse get instantly better because he's no longer in active addiction. That doesn't mean they're good enough for you to keep being married indefinitely. That's a trick. It's a cunning, it's alluring to think that the worst is behind us. And even if it is, there's a whole lot of other mess to clean up. And we realized that just in time. We really did. We realized that with my wife wandering around Manhattan, giving me no reason why she was still wandering around Manhattan, saying she'd be home in an hour, and she came home like in 4 hours. And it was just completely unlike her. And it was just the cap to a bunch of things that were either argumentative or just kind of like detached. Argumentative I can take. When she starts being detached, that's really got me. And eventually I realized that, this whole amends thing has to be a lot more involved than "I'm sorry." When it comes to the person who I swore to love and honor as long as I lived, and obviously had not really lived up to that vow for an extended period of time.
So what did that finally look like?
The amends?
Yeah.
The amends.
Without giving away the whole book, obviously, because we want people to read it.
Well,
but,
it started with me pissing her off because I said, you know what, it's not me, it's you. Try hearing that from the guy who almost ruined your life several times,
Yeah.
But I followed that up smartly before she took a swing at me. I followed that up with, it's the damage I caused you that hasn't been really dealt with yet. And I know you ain't going to Al-Anon. Should we go to couples therapy? Maybe, but we ended up not doing that. We probably should have. That would have probably helped. But there was just a lot of hurt there, a lot of Chris-caused hurt that only Patty could give the okay to start working on. And for the sake of doing so expediently, Chris had to kind of be involved in that because I knew her better than anybody else. You know, she'd basically been hiding her true self from people for 4 years at that point because her husband was a hopeless addict.
Mm.
And even besides that, you know, we had been dating since 1998 at that point. You know, we're talking about 2012 now, and it's still 14, I've known her for
Mhm.
14 years, you know, so
Yeah.
it's not like we got married in a whirlwind that I knew her for 3 years at this point. So us cleaning that up together took a lot of bickering, you know, a lot of saying, you know, you're acting like a phony, a lot of us saying, you're not letting me in, a lot of us
Mhm.
saying, you know, you're not giving ground because you are still mad at me from the past, and I'm not giving ground because I'm just being a dick, you know. And it's like it was a lot of bickering. But arguing in marriages gets really is highly underrated. I think
Mhm.
we needed to fight it out. We needed to learn how to fight it out, though. Fight it out productively. Fight for something, not just against
Mhm.
each other.
Mhm. Well, I like that. Something that was interesting to me that you wrote about in here was the, again, going back to the imbalance and the fact that um, there was, what did you call it? The underdog and the, I don't know, one of you had all the sort of the power in the relationship because she had the money, the home, she had
Right.
all was doing all the functioning, and you were, you had none of that. And not only did you have to regain that, but she had to actually cede space for you to do that. And I can see how, for someone who has been as deeply betrayed as she was, it could be really difficult to open up space for anyone to do that,
That's
honestly,
right.
but let alone the person who had been lying to her as long
That's
as he
right.
had. So
Right. And there's two parts of this. That's right. It's very difficult for somebody who has all the high ground in a marriage, even if she loves the person that has
mhm,
kind of dropped off that. She didn't kick me off of it. I fell off of it. Right.
mhm,
So she has all the high ground, and she has to make room on that
mhm,
high ground for somebody who hurt her deeply that she doesn't fully trust quite yet, um, and who is basically pleading his case through a recovery program that she's not really familiar with, that she doesn't have
mhm,
experience with, that he is more and more ready on an expedited basis, no less. This isn't 5 years into the marriage. This is 5 years into recovery. This is 18 months in a recovery, 15
mhm,
months in a recovery. She's
mhm.
ceding space that she doesn't even know if it's a good idea to cede.
Right.
And going back to what I said before about folks taking accountability, if somebody was to come to Patty and say, well, your husband was just sick for 3 years, that makes it very difficult for her to justify and fully digest the hurt that I caused her, which in my
Mhm,
opinion is necessary for the healing process to begin. You can't address something that you don't acknowledge fully. And if you're letting the addict off the hook just because he happened to have a condition, a sickness at that point, and you're not making him take accountability for his actions, then you're not letting the person closest to him in the world who is trying to make amends with him ardently and
mhm,
honestly, you're not letting that person feel everything that she needs to feel and take all the requisite steps from there to actually help heal the union.
mhm,
So I'm not saying that just because I'm not big on some of the, I guess, soft language that has come out with, that has emerged over the last 10 years. I'm doing it because I think it's unhelpful.
mhm,
I think it's incomplete thinking that if you walk down it far enough, there's actual harm there.
mhm. Yeah. Something that struck me, you know, there's a passage where you are describing um, the damage done to Patty's psyche, like her own personality, negative traits that emerged.
Hmm.
I think cynicism, anger. And what was interesting to me reading about that is, and also some of the things that you did, especially the lying, and how this you didn't use the word abuse in here, but to me it parallels some narratives of abuse, where gaslighting is used as a tool of control and the person starts to,
Absolutely.
stop trust, and the effects as well are, fairly well documented effects in a lot of people of abuse. Some of them are things that I have experienced myself.
Sure.
Um, And so I thought it was interesting to see that laid out. And I was curious if you could talk about how she addressed that, and do you feel that that journey is complete? Is she, or is it ongoing? Has she been able to recover herself, or are there lingering effects?
Interesting, and I agree with you. I don't love bandying words or like abuse around liberally, but I think that's right. I think that's right. I think that anybody who's living with an addicted spouse is a victim of abuse right in that moment, no doubt about it. And an addict will do whatever he can to keep doing what he has to do, and that I will
Mhm.
lie. She stole from her. Um, and it was brutal, and the
Mhm.
idea that she was even close to being as good, as functional a person, as
Mhm.
complete a person. And we're the same age, so Patty was a 31-year-old woman with a six-figure salary in Manhattan, and a place she just bought in Brooklyn. I mean, she was
Mhm.
a together person. I mean, this is a very competent, intelligent, you know person who was very likable, and I chipped away at that something fierce.
Mhm.
And that is definitely abusive, no doubt about it. Now, what's great about addiction is that the flip side of it allows you and the people around you, especially I would think the person closest to you, wife. Luckily, my son never saw me drink or drug because he's younger than my sobriety date. Um, it allows you to get weller than well.
Mhm.
Um, so we have a lot of it's not nearly as bad as dot 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 in our
Mhm.
toolbox these days. And she definitely understands that that Chris is very unlikely to come back every time the sun comes up and he hasn't had a drink the previous day.
Mhm.
Right. So there is kind of a subsection of addiction where you become a really different person that you really learn to abhor. And luckily, on the flip side, you get the opportunity not only to recover, but to get to become a better person than you ever were. Because if I just became the same person I was before I started drinking and drugging, I'd drink and drug again because those character
Mhm.
defects are still there.
Mhm.
The self-loathing, the anger. Oh God, the anger.
Mhm.
Um, that stuff needed to be diminished significantly in order for me to stay sober. And then once you become better than the person, you become a different person than you were before. Your spouse needs to keep pace a little bit.
Mhm.
And Patty and to her credit, she didn't have to do any of that. She would have been just fine.
Mhm.
She
Mhm.
she wasn't gonna descend into drugs or alcohol herself. She might have ended up divorced, but she decided to do what she had to do, forgive what she had to forgive, even if she couldn't forget it. um, and 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 get better. And I think on a pace that was expedited because of our age, because at
Mhm.
some point we were either going to have a kid or not, and the clock was ticking. That's a kind of a circumstantial, unique aspect to my memoir as well. It's our age when all this happened.
Mhm.
We ended up having our first and only son one day after my wife's 37th birthday, which is 2 days after my 37th birthday. So now we have
Mhm.
March 16th, 17th, and 18th, which is insane having three
Yeah.
kids. I have no birthday anymore, which is completely fine because it's all
Yeah.
for him. But
Mm.
did I answer your question completely? I know I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
Well, um, that
The abuse,
speaks to,
the
well, it
abuse
speaks to
thing.
the, yeah, I don't need to go into that too deeply, but I want to say it was like brave of you to say that and to be able to hear me bring that up. But I'm also interested because you talk about, for example, a development of a sort of broader cynicism and anger in her that was also outwardly, affected her outward interactions as well as the ones within the marriage. And um, how has that trajectory been for her in terms of actually repairing like her whole self and her whole relations with, because I know that when the closest person to you has betrayed you and lied to you, like it affects everything. Like you don't trust anyone anymore. And has she gotten that back, or is there still some sort of hardening, do you think, that she'll never lose?
She's a softer person now than she was before I started drinking and drugging.
Really?
And I think our journey together has been a part of that. I think she found abilities to forgive and work on me and on herself, and to and resilience that she may never have known that she
Mm-hmm.
had. And I think also in a world where we flip Facebook on and it is everybody smiling and pretending to be a lot happier and moral than they actually are.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I can actually be candid with our friends.
Mm-hmm.
And because of, like you said, this is some pretty salty stuff to have out in the public space.
Mm-hmm.
Our friends' problems tend to be, they don't tend to really approach that. So it encourages,
at least the ones they talk about in public.
Right. It encourages other people to be very open with us. And I think because it's just as a complete side effect of all this, just kind of a bonus of getting better and getting to where we are today, it's enriched our friendships. And the some of the people who were fair weather friends before this all happened have faded away. And a lot of, and some more of the people who we realized were really worth knowing have stuck around and have become even closer. They become more like family. So that's a really nice, like I said, it's a really nice side effect to all this. Patty is a lot more engaging. I think being a mom brought that out in her too. I think she's more of a leader than she used to be. I think maybe in her profession might have helped with that too. But I think, maybe the experiences that she had to go through here gave her some more confidence, because God, if she could do what she did with this addict, she could do a lot, and I've never ceased to be impressed with her throughout the process. Again, I'm far more impressed with her than I am for saving my own life. It's easy to reach for a life preserver when someone's throwing it to you. It's hard to do it when you don't know that you need one.
Right. Another thing that I liked about this book is a passage where you kind of take on the notion of codependency and, challenge the idea that maybe everyone who is in a relationship with an addict is codependent for sort of putting up with, or even, you didn't like the word enabling, but you said something about, all she did was love her partner. And I like that. And I think that, it ties into some discussions that I've been part of about sort of the hyper individualism of North American culture. And, this idea that we should all, I don't know, this notion that treats things like, just really loving and trusting someone and wanting to help them is codependent. That we should all just be totally self-sufficient, and which of course is very culturally specific to us. I don't know if you want to talk about that or just listen to me gush about it, but
I think codependency gets thrown around a lot. I think a lot of terms get thrown around a lot where they may not apply. But codependency, again, it's a blurry label to put on something, especially a spouse who's trying desperately to help her, husband, who she's seen the best of and is now seeing the worst of. At what point is she being enabling and throwing, good money after bad money, right? At what point is she really reaching past something that's realistic? And at what point, and on the conversely, at what point is she just trying to do her best to in a really difficult situation? I don't, part of what led me to that opinion in terms of Patty's, this codependency being thrown around maybe a little bit too much, is that Patty is, if anybody who knows her say that this is not someone who's a codependent person. She again, this is a 31 years old, 6-figure salary in Manhattan, apartment in Brooklyn. You know, I mean, this is not somebody who needed anybody. She could have kicked me to the curb and been over it in a couple of months. Okay. So the idea that she was seeing the need, the notion that she was living in any means vicariously through me is nonsense. The only explanation for it is the fact that she just loved her husband. And I think that's a pretty damn good excuse. You know, I think kindness is a pretty good reason.
It's interesting, going back to the abuse parallel. There was a book I read a few years ago called Stop Signs, about signs of potentially abusive relationships. But one of the things it talks about is a study that was done on character traits of specifically women who got into abusive relationships with men. And the commonalities were surprising, or might be surprising to some people. But they, these women were not by any means, weak or malleable or easily manipulated. They tended to be, I remember two of the strongest factors were resilience and resourcefulness. And another factor was high empathy. So high empathy, resilient, resourceful. So you've got someone who is able to put themselves in their partner's shoes, able to see things from their perspective. They're resourceful, so they, believe that they can fix things for a very long time, and they're resilient, so they can put up with something that other people wouldn't be able to put up with for a much longer period of time. So, and
that's interesting. I think the one thing that Patty is lacking there is empathy. Is a high marker of empathy. I think it's different, and let me qualify that. The caveat there is that it's very hard to empathize with an addict unless you are one yourself. It is very hard to put yourself in the shoes of someone who will drink and drug themselves to the brink of death, who will take themselves to the brink of death and bankruptcy and homelessness just to put another line of cocaine up his nose. If you don't have that proclivity yourself, that's not, I don't think that's an easy thing to do. And I really do think that that's the reason that group-centric recovery has always been probably the most useful, because it takes it, you're sitting amongst your own people. There is empathy in that room. Yeah, and getting back to, in terms of abuse, I think luckily, not luckily, I mean, I would never hit her. We never got physical like that. In terms of psychological abuse, though, if my actions and the way I acted toward her had continued into sobriety, once I got sober, she would have left. She would have left. That's not the woman I know. And the only reason she's still here is because it has, it has turned around, and she's been a big part of that.
Is there anything that I haven't covered yet that you want to talk about in this interview?
I don't know. It's interesting. I really do think that complacency and naivete drive this, and it's really the struggles that people fall into in early recovery. Once one partner, especially when it's one partner, our experience is that I'm the addict and she's kind of the normie, quote unquote, right? And we didn't understand that you can't, the spouse or partner of an addict can't just shrug off that damage. It just because it's so much less than what the addict caused himself doesn't mean it's not going to be a major factor in the union moving forward if it's left unaddressed. And we didn't know any better. That's the only reason we didn't do anything about it, is we didn't know any better. Everybody, wants to grab an addict and tell them 90 meetings in 90 days or whatever, whatever really intensive early recovery things that they need to do to start, the process of really getting on firm ground. They don't give you a lot of advice on what to do with your wife sitting at home, waiting and worrying about you. And it all seems like it's getting better until it's not anymore. But the other side of it again is when you end up kind of reuniting as 2.0 versions of yourselves, it's infinitely worth it. In 4 years after I'm sober, we're having a child and owning a home and, both doing well professionally. And that's kind of, luckily it's continued, getting to where we are today was grueling, but gratifying. And I hope that this book can, help a few people who are just are, one of them got sober and then they're looking at each other and say, okay, now what? That's what this book is all about. It's about answering the now what. I hope. And, I know it's a personal experience and memoirs are not one size fit all solutions, but there simply weren't enough solutions out there. There weren't anybody giving their examples and experience, strength and hope on this particular niche of recovery. And I hope that this can help. Hope that this can put a little dent in that.
Yeah. So if I may ask, why did you bring it to, at the time it was Thorntree Press, now Thornapple Press? Why did you choose us as a publisher?
Well, one of your authors, Joellen, Joellen, I don't know how, I could never her last name is, it's either Naughty or Not. I guess it's Naughty. Okay.
Yeah.
We dated in kindergarten.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We were boyfriend and girlfriend in kindergarten. Yeah, we went to we grew up in the same town. Grew up in Kearney, New Jersey. And I've been looking around and I'd been looking around and I didn't really find any takers. I think people thought it was interesting, but not quite right for them. And Joellen actually said, hey, I just recently got a book published and this sounds like something that Eve might be interested in. And that's kind of how we connected.
Okay.
So yeah, I still only live about 10 minutes from Joellen. So at some point I need to take her out to lunch and kind of not rekindle an old flame, but take her out to lunch at least and say hi. So
yeah. That gives me an opportunity to plug Joellen's newest book, which I'm also really excited about. So these two in it together.
I'm looking forward to that because it's kind of a more expansive, a broader audience sequel to the Monsters book, right? Which was kind of specific to sexuality.
Right.
I'm looking forward to reading that as well.
Yeah, and I'll be interviewing her in a few weeks, I think, as well.
Good. Tell her I said hi.
Yeah, so I will. So In It Together is a how-to on dealing with depression with your partner's friends and family. So
I think that's coming out in March, right?
Yeah, just a couple months.
Good.
So congratulations to both of you.
Thank you.
You're book twins.
I know. Being called an author is very weird. Very weird. It's an odd thing.
Yeah, I've never quite gotten used to it. But.
Yeah. Right. It just seems like I'm looking behind, like, what? Oh, you mean me?
Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah.
Anything else? Anything else I can answer?
Where can people find you online, if anywhere?
Online,
or where can people find you apart from your book?
How much longer I'm on Twitter, given the current environment?
Yeah.
If he banishes one more journalist for following him, I'm gone. But for now, I'm at Chris Dale Writer on Twitter, Christopher Dale on Facebook, Christopher Dale on LinkedIn, and those are usually the And if you just Google me, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff that I've written on the side about everything from sobriety to relationships to politics to rescue animals. I've been kind of an avid writer for about 8-9 years now. So. Which took not being high on coke to hence the reason. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much and it was great talking to you. And again, the book is Better Halves, Rebuilding a Post-Addiction Marriage by Christopher Dale, published by Thornapple Press.
Thank you.
And there'll be a purchase link in the description, the video description.
Thank you, Eve.
Yeah, thank you.